Here is the story you already know. Two young men in a California garage, a soldering iron between them, building the future one circuit board at a time. One of them is a barefoot genius who sees the whole world differently. The other is the greatest engineer of his generation. They have almost no money and almost no idea what they are doing, but they have a dream, and the dream is a computer in every home. Nobody believes them. And then, against every odd, they build the most valuable company in human history. It is a beautiful story. It is the founding myth of Silicon Valley, printed on 1,000 dorm room posters. And almost none of it explains why Apple actually won. Because Apple did not win by dreaming. Apple won by understanding something about money that its competitors refused to learn, and it very nearly died 3 separate times before that lesson finally took. The garage is real, the genius is real. But the garage is not where the money came from, and the dream is not what kept the lights on. What kept the lights on was a machine. A specific, ruthless, endlessly repeatable machine for turning cheap parts into expensive objects, and expensive objects into loyalty you could not buy your way out of. This is the story of that machine. Let us start with the number that breaks the myth. In 1997, Apple Computer was roughly 90 days from running out of cash. Not struggling, not underperforming, 90 days from insolvency, from the kind of bankruptcy where the lawyers arrive and the furniture gets sold. This is the same company that had gone public 17 years earlier and minted more millionaires in a single afternoon than any offering in a generation. In between those two moments, Apple did almost everything the myth says a great company should do. It innovated, it designed beautiful products, it hired brilliant people, and it still walked itself directly to the edge of the grave. Because innovation was never the thing that made Apple money, and the people running it had confused the two. Here's the uncomfortable truth the founding story hides. A garage is not a business. Wozniak's circuit board was a marvel, but a marvel does not have a supply chain, a distribution deal, a marketing budget, or a way to survive the month when nobody buys anything. The Apple you know was not built by the two Steves in that garage. It was built by a third man, a semi-retired engineer named Mike Markkula, who looked at a wooden crate full of hand-soldered boards and did the one thing neither founder could do. He wrote a business plan. And he wrote a check. So let us talk about what it actually costs to build Apple, because the myth erases every dollar of it. The famous garage product, the Apple I, was not a company. It was 50 circuit boards ordered by a single local shop called the Byte Shop, sold at around $666 each, boards only, no case, no keyboard, no screen. To fund even that tiny order, Jobs sold his Volkswagen van and Wozniak sold his prized calculator. That is the whole capital base of the legend. A van and a calculator. It is a wonderful anecdote, and it is completely insufficient to build anything that lasts. There was a third founder, Ronald Wayne, who held 10% of the company and drew the first logo. He got nervous about the debts the partnership might take on, and he sold his stake back for $800. That 10% would later be worth tens of billions. His caution is the most expensive act of financial prudence in history, and it tells you exactly how fragile this thing was at the start. The real money, the money that turned a hobby into a corporation, arrived in 1907 when Markkula put in around $250,000 in investment and secured a line of credit besides. He did not buy a dream. He bought a third of the company and a seat at the table, and in exchange he brought the two things the founders lacked entirely: adult capital and a plan to spend it. Without that check, the garage stays a garage, and you have never heard either of their names. What Markkula's money bought was the Apple II, and the Apple II is where the myth and the machine briefly agree. Because for once the company got everything right at the same time. It was a real product, cased and finished and sold to ordinary people, not a bare board for hobbyists. But even here, the thing that made it a fortune was not the hardware. It was a piece of software the company did not write and barely understood, the first spreadsheet. A program that let a small business owner do a month of accounting in an afternoon. Suddenly, the Apple II was not a toy for enthusiasts. It was the only machine that ran the one program a certain kind of buyer could not live without. And those buyers did not haggle over price because the machine paid for itself in a week. That is the engine in embryo. Find the thing the customer cannot get anywhere else, attach it to your hardware, and the price stops being a negotiation. The money came so fast and so heavily that by December of 1980, the company went public. And the offering was so oversubscribed that it created hundreds of millionaires in a single day and valued a 5-year-old company at well over $1 billion. Everyone involved learned exactly the wrong lesson from that afternoon. They learned that Apple was magic. They should have learned that Apple was a margin with a moat around it, and that the moat, not the magic, was the asset. Now we reach the actual engine, the counterintuitive thing that most people get wrong even when they are staring right at it. Ask 100 people why Apple is rich, and most of them will say innovation. They invented the mouse, the graphical screen, the smartphone. That answer is not just incomplete, it is nearly backwards. Apple did not invent the mouse, it saw one at Xerox. It did not invent the graphical interface, the digital music player, or even the smartphone. What Apple built, and built better than anyone alive, was a margin. Watch how the machine works. Take components that are, individually, commodities. A screen, a battery, a processor, a slab of aluminium. Every one of Apple's competitors can buy the same parts from the same suppliers at roughly the same price. That is the trap the whole industry lives in. A race to the bottom where computers become interchangeable boxes and the only way to win a sale is to be a few dollars cheaper than the box beside you. Apple refused to play that game. Instead, it took those commodity parts, wrapped them in software nobody else was allowed to touch, sealed them inside an object designed to feel inevitable, and sold the result not for a small markup but for 2 or 3 times what the parts inside it cost. The genius was never the components. The genius was convincing the customer that the assembled whole was worth a premium the individual pieces could never command, and then making that premium feel not like a tax, but like a privilege. And here's the part that turns a good margin into an unbreakable one. Once you have bought into Apple, leaving costs you, not in dollars at the register, but in everything you would have to abandon. Your files, your photos, your purchased music, the accessories that only fit their sockets, the muscle memory of an interface built to feel like an extension of your hand. Apple learned, earlier and more deliberately than anyone, that the second sale is where the empire lives. The first device is bait. It is the thing you agonize over and compare and maybe even find overpriced. But the moment it is in your life, the walls go up quietly around you, and the next purchase is not really a decision anymore. It is a renewal. This is the true machine, not invention. Enclosure. A commodity dressed as a luxury, sold at a luxury's margin, wrapped in switching costs so high that the customer defends the price for you. Every product Apple has ever shipped, from the Apple II to the object in your pocket right now, is a variation on that single move. Put a number on it and the trick becomes obvious. When a rival sells you a laptop, it buys the parts, screws them together, and takes a slim cut on top. Because a dozen other companies are selling the same parts screwed together the same way, and the only lever any of them has is price. When Apple sells you the same class of machine, the parts inside costed a similar amount. But the number on the tag is far larger, and the difference does not vanish into better components. It is the margin, and the margin is the whole company. That gap is not paid for by aluminium or glass. It is paid for by the belief that this particular assembly of ordinary parts is worth more than any other. A belief manufactured by design, by advertising, by the feel of the thing in the hand. And above all, by the fact that once you own one, the alternatives feel like a downgrade even when they are cheaper and faster on paper. Competitors saw the premium and assumed it was arrogance. It was not arrogance. It was the business model. Every dollar of that gap, multiplied across hundreds of millions of units, is why one company holds more cash than most governments. But knowing the machine and running it are two different things, and this is where the story turns dark. Because Apple spent more than a decade forgetting its own engine and nearly paid for it with its life. The trouble started, as it so often does, with success. The Apple II was a genuine phenomenon carried to greatness on the back of the first killer spreadsheet. And for a while the money poured in so fast that nobody had to think hard about where it came from. Then came the follow-ups, and the follow-ups revealed the rot. The Lisa launched at nearly $10,000, a price that assumed the brand alone could carry any number, and it failed. The Macintosh arrived in 1984 with the most celebrated advertisement ever broadcast. A genuine leap in design, and after the initial rush, its sales sagged too. Because a beautiful machine that cannot run the software people need is a sculpture, not a product. In the middle of this, the company did the thing companies do when the founder becomes inconvenient. It pushed Steve Jobs out, the man he had personally recruited. A marketing executive lured from a soft drinks giant with a single famous line about whether he wanted to sell sugar water or change the world won the power struggle. And Jobs, the keeper of the machine, whatever his flaws, was gone. What followed is the part of the story the myth prefers to skip, the wilderness years. And they are the most instructive years of all because they show you exactly what happens when a company keeps the brand but loses the discipline underneath it. Under a succession of leaders, Apple did the opposite of everything that made it rich. Instead of a tight line of objects you could hold in your head, it sprawled into dozens of overlapping models with names nobody could keep straight, each one cannibalizing the next. It poured a fortune into a handheld device that promised to read your handwriting and mostly could not, becoming a punchline instead of a product. And then it made the single most revealing mistake of all. Desperate for volume, it began licensing its operating system to other manufacturers, letting them build cheaper machines that ran the same software. Think about what that does to the machine we just described. The entire engine depended on the whole being sealed, on the software and the hardware, and the experience being available from exactly one source at exactly one premium. The moment you let a rival sell a cheaper box running your software, you have handed away the enclosure with your own hands. The clones did not expand the market. They ate it from the inside, peeling off Apple's own highest margin customers and replacing $3,000 sales with royalties measured in tens of dollars. The brand was still famous. The margin was gone. And a company that had forgotten it lived on margin was, by 1996, a company waiting to die. Look closely at that licensing decision because it is the purest example in business history of a company sawing through the branch it is sitting on. The people who made it were not fools. They were staring at a rival operating system that ran on cheap machines from 100 manufacturers and had swallowed the world. And they reasoned, sensibly enough, that the way to fight volume was with volume. So they let others build the boxes and collected a royalty on each one. But a royalty of a few tens of dollars is not the same shape of money as the margin on a whole sealed machine. And worse, every clone sold was very often a sale stolen from Apple's own catalog. They were not reaching new customers. They were selling their existing, loyal, high-margin customers a cheaper way to leave and thanking the clone makers for the privilege with a discount. Add to that a handheld gamble that promised to read your handwriting and became a national joke. A product line so bloated that even the sales staff could not explain the difference between the models, and a pattern of chasing every market at once, and you have a company that has kept every ounce of its fame and shed every ounce of its discipline. The romance was fully intact. The engine was in pieces on the floor. So we arrive back at that 90-day number, and now you understand it. Apple was not brought low by a lack of ideas. It was drowning in ideas, in products, in press coverage, in nostalgia. It was brought low because it had detached the brand from the engine, kept the romance, and thrown away the mechanics. And no amount of beautiful design can pay a payroll when your margins have been given away for free. This is the trap that kills strong operators in every industry, not just this one. You build something extraordinary. It works. The money flows. And in the good years, you slowly forget which part of the machine actually prints the money, until you are cheerfully dismantling it in the name of growth and calling the destruction a strategy. Apple did everything right by the standards of the myth and nearly buried itself, and it took a near-death experience to remember the one thing it should never have forgotten. The rescue is famous, but watch it as economics rather than as legend. Apple bought a small company to get its operating system, and the founder came back through that side door. And the first things he did were not visionary in the romantic sense at all. They were acts of subtraction. He took a humiliating investment from the great rival in the software business, $150 million, and swallowed the humiliation because cash does not care about pride. He killed the licensing program and pulled the software back behind the wall, sealing the enclosure shut again. And he took a product line of dozens of confusing machines and drew, on a whiteboard, a simple grid of 4 boxes. Desktop and portable, consumer and professional. 4 products. Everything that did not fit one of those four boxes was canceled, no matter how loved. This was not the act of a dreamer. It was the act of a man who had remembered the machine and was rebuilding it plank by plank. One source, one premium, one sealed experience. Nothing that dilutes the margin, nothing that confuses the customer about why the object in front of them costs what it costs. And from that rebuilt engine came everything you think of as Apple now. A friendly, translucent computer that made the company briefly beloved again. Then a small white music player that did nothing a dozen rivals could not do on paper, except that it slotted into a sealed system of software and a store. So that once your music lived inside Apple's walls, the next device you bought was chosen for you. Then a phone that folded the computer, the music player, and the enclosure into a single object and turned the whole world into customers who defend the price. Each of these looks, from the outside, like a bolt of pure invention. Each of them is, underneath, the same 1970s machine running at planetary scale. Commodity parts. A sealed experience. A luxury margin. Switching costs that make the second sale inevitable and the customer loyal past the point of reason. And then the machine grew a second stomach, one the founders in the garage could never have imagined. For its first 30 years, Apple made money the honest, lumpy way by selling you an object and then waiting, sometimes years, for you to want another. But a sealed world full of loyal people is not just a place to sell hardware. It is a place to charge rent. Once hundreds of millions of customers lived inside the walls, Apple began taking a cut of everything that happened there. A slice of every song, every app, every subscription, every payment, every upgrade in storage because the device was quietly built to run out of room. This is the part of the engine that turned a great company into an unstoppable one, because rent does not depend on convincing you to buy a new machine. It arrives every month whether you upgrade or not, at almost no cost to produce, and it climbs as the walls grow taller. The hardware, the thing everyone still thinks of as the product, slowly became the toll booth. The real business became the road behind it. A customer who once paid Apple every 3 years now pays Apple every 30 days and does not even feel the hand in the pocket. Because each individual charge is small and the alternative is climbing back over a wall built specifically to be too high. This was always the destination of the enclosure. Get them inside, seal the exits, and then simply be there, taking a modest and unavoidable percentage of a modern life forever. So let us end where every honest story of a business has to end, with the two versions of it, because Apple is both. Here's the version that works. You understand that you are not in the business of invention, but in the business of margin and enclosure. You keep the line ruthlessly small, you never let anyone else sell your experience cheaper. You treat the first sale as bait and the second as the harvest. And you defend the wall around your customers as if your life depends on it, because it does. Run the machine that way and you become the most valuable company on earth. And the myth of the garage becomes a lovely story you are rich enough to let people believe. And here's the version that does not work, the version Apple itself lived through for more than a decade. You believe your own founding story. You decide the magic was the ideas and the design and the brilliance in the room, and you forget the boring, unglamorous engine underneath. You chase volume, you license away the thing that made you special, you sprawl your line to cover every possible buyer, and you mistake being famous for being profitable. Do that, and it does not matter how beloved you are or how good your best product is. You will find yourself 90 days from the end, wondering how a company that did everything the story told it to do ended up here. Apple is not the most valuable company in history, because two men had a dream in a garage. It is the most valuable company in history because, after nearly dying to prove